Danny Ramos is targeted for termination by a new endoskeleton liquid metal hybrid Terminator known as the Rev 9, a new Terminator sent back in time to terminate her. Pans. Lucky for her, though, a machine-human hybrid was sent back in time to protect Danny from this seemingly indestructible Rev 9. But even luckier for them, though, they get backup from the one and only Sarah Connor. The Terminator franchise is one of the most disappointingly mediocre movie franchises I have ever seen. I will always love the first two movies, though. They still hold a very special place in my heart for just how amazing they are in almost every single way. Unfortunately, basically every Terminator movie since Terminator 2 has been lackluster at best and damn near god-awful at worst. Yet somehow, this franchise still manages to bounce back from obscurity every few years. I mean, we're on 6, guys. 6 freaking Terminator movies, and 3 of them are meant to be Terminator 3! So now we have Terminator Dark Fate, or as I like to call it, Terminator 3 3.0. And I'll admit, I was actually pretty excited for this movie. When I first heard it was getting made, I thought, oh yay, another shitty Terminator sequel that's more than likely gonna F up this timeline even more royally than the last one. And I know that's a negative outlook, but I mean, then as soon as I heard that not only James Cameron, the writer and director of Terminator 1 and 2, two of the greatest movies ever made, was producing with Tim Miller, the director of Deadpool, directing, but they were gonna bring back Linda Hamilton to play Sarah Connor once again. I got so hyped. I was so happy. I genuinely thought that things were looking up for this franchise. I genuinely thought that! Look, I really can't talk about this movie without spoiling it because I have a lot of things to say and I can't talk about those things without spoiling the whole movie. So if you haven't seen Terminator Dark Fate, actually want to see it and don't want me to spoil it for you, then click away now. Otherwise, proceed at your own risk. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, the John Connor thing. So when the movie begins, we see a de-aged Sarah Connor and a de-aged John Connor, both of which look very impressive, I have to say. They're just sitting down, chilling in a restaurant somewhere when, BAM! A Terminator shows up and shoots John Connor, and now he's dead. We're done! You pulled an Alien 3. I know a lot of people made this point in their own reviews, but I'm not going to be an exception because I think it's a legitimately good point, and even before I watched a few reviews for this movie, Alien 3 was exactly what popped up into my mind as soon as John Connor died. In Aliens, we got invested in the characters Newt and Hicks. We cared about them and this family dynamic that was built between them and Ripley. Then Alien 3 happened and David Fincher was like, yeah, let's kill him. While I have no problem admitting that I actually love Alien 3, yes, I just said that, killing off Newt and Hicks like that was just a disservice to those characters, and it makes Aliens seem less important in the grand scheme of things because you're just gonna be like, I'm glad you got out of that place, even though you're just gonna freaking die in the next one. Well, now that's how I'm gonna feel whenever I watch Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Like with Aliens, I'll still watch T2 and absolutely love it, but in the back of my mind, I'm just gonna be thinking, he dead. He very dead. The important mission to protect John Connor, destroying Skynet, and all those sacrifices made in T1 and T2 just don't matter now because John Connor's just gonna freaking die, and then Legion, aka Skynet 2.0, is just gonna show up and take over the world. I wouldn't have been quite as peeved off if they'd actually justified that scene. I was actually waiting for some sort of justification of that decision, but this movie doesn't even have a reason for that. It's revealed that Danny, the new character they're trying to protect in this new timeline, don't worry, I'll get to that, is going to be the one to lead the resistance against the machines in this new timeline. She's essentially the new John Connor. Hell, Sarah Connor even says she's the new John Connor. It's so cringe-inducingly obvious and on the nose that it almost feels insulting, not just to John Connor as a character, but to the audience as well, because it just looks like the filmmakers were too afraid that people wouldn't like it if she was a completely new and original character, and if that's genuinely the case, then boy oh boy were they wrong. Terminator 3 3.0 genuinely feels like a bad attempt to replace that storyline that we all know and love by retelling that story with a slightly different character, which leads me to my next big problem with this movie. This movie relies way too much on plot elements from the other movies. It is actually insane how much this movie borrows from the other movies. We have a seemingly random person who is marked for termination by an evil AI from the future. That person turns out to be the future leader of the human resistance. We have a protector sent back in time by the human resistance who dies in the end protecting said person. Also, that protector is a human-machine hybrid. There's yet another liquid metal Terminator who also has a metal endoskeleton underneath them, which is also destroyed by melting it. The characters end up going on a road trip through the desert, and they go to a secret location where they find a room full of guns. Oh, and there's a reprogrammed Terminator! I'm not completely against reusing plot points from the originals in the sequels, so long as it's done in a way that makes sense, isn't boring, and doesn't just feel like it's rehashing a film or films that came before it. Unfortunately, Terminator 3 3.0 is the complete opposite of all three of those things. I am so sick of the sequels just trying to copy the other movies in an attempt to get fans to like them just a little more because it's stuff they recognize. I mean, I don't even like Terminator Salvation, but at least that movie actually tried to do something different instead of just rehashing T2 again. It just cannot figure out how to be a series without being yet another movie about somebody protecting somebody from another Terminator. Why can't we see an original story that doesn't involve the Connors, Arnold, or the same plot they've been recycling over and over for decades? I do find it kind of ironic that for a movie that rehashes so many plot elements from the movies that came before it, it's pretty convoluted. For a start, my biggest issue with the franchise as a whole is that the timeline is just so royally screwed now. And there is always a risk of stuff like that happening when time travel is incorporated into movies, but now with the Terminator movies, there's just so much going on that it's really impossible to figure this timeline out. I mean, this new movie seems to think that when you prevent one future from happening, a new carbon copy of that future will be created, but the only difference between the carbon copy and the original future is that things now have different names. It might have made more sense if they'd gone to the trouble of explaining it and developing it a little more, but we don't really get much aside from the fact that it's basically Skynet 2.0, and that people just don't learn? Okay. It's easy to make a summary of events and try to put things in a certain order, but trust me, I tried and it didn't help, especially considering this movie introduces a completely new future to mess things up even more, even though this new future is a carbon copy of the original future. Another thing that doesn't really make sense is Arnold Schwarzenegger's role in the movie. I will say that Arnold is actually one of the best parts of this movie. He gives such a good performance. It's still really robotic like it's always been because, you know, he's playing a T-800 again. But just based off the conversations he has with other characters, the little things he does with his face and mannerisms, you can tell that he's just on the edge of being human, and I love that concept. I actually love the idea of a Terminator, as bizarre as it sounds, just settling down and trying to have a normal life with a family and a job, which turns out to be installing drapes. Which is just so weird, it's amazing, and that fact alone results in some of the movie's funniest scenes. His lines are genuinely funny, his comedic timing is almost perfect, and I like that his skin has aged over the years because it is living tissue over metal endoskeleton. What doesn't make sense is how he got there. The series has established that a Terminator just can't decide that it wants to live a normal life. It just doesn't happen. You can teach Terminators things by switching one of the chips in their heads like they did in T2. However, the idea that a Terminator who kills someone like John Connor feels bad after doing it, wishes that he hasn't done it, and develops a conscience is an intriguing premise. I just wish they had done it in a way that actually made sense. Because I just don't buy that a Terminator would just out of nowhere decide he feels bad for killing someone and then goes and has a normal life with a family and installing freaking drapes. Although it is the closest thing we get to an original idea in this movie, so that's a bonus. But there's also just little things that don't make sense, like how the T-800 can survive being crushed by a freaking dam, even though the T-800 in the first movie was crushed by a hydraulic press. Or how Sarah Connor is able to just walk around in the open amongst thousands of people multiple times in the movie despite being wanted in 53 states across America. 53! Just getting back to the performances, everyone in this movie is great. Even though I hate that Natalia Reyes' character is basically John Connor 2.0, she gives a fabulous performance, and she was really good in some of the more emotional or tense scenes. She gave this role her absolute all, and from a performance standpoint, she did not disappoint. Mackenzie Davis is also amazing as Grace, a human-machine hybrid thing. I liked her character quite a bit. She added a lot of physicality to this role, and she was very badass. Linda Hamilton was wonderful in this movie. It was so awesome to see her back as Sarah Connor. When she first appears in this movie at the end of that car chase and just destroys the Rev 9, I had such a huge grin on my face. I was grinning like a crazy person. It was such an awesome moment. She is by far the best part of this movie, and she still fits perfectly in those boots all these years later. Despite the fact that I don't like the way John Connor's death is handled in this movie, I love how they explored Sarah's grief after losing her son. That was actually very emotional, and she had the best arc in the whole movie, which is why I cared about her the most. I don't like how they handle the theme of change in this movie. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the things I love about the first two movies, and even Rise of the Machines, is that the people we meet at the beginning of those movies are not the same people we see at the end of them. The characters change as people as the movie progresses. They try to do that here, but it's not as impactful purely because we don't get enough backstory for these characters. In the first Terminator movie, a good chunk of the movie is spent getting to know who Sarah Connor is before the action starts. We learn she's a waitress, she likes going out, having fun and going to parties with her friends, and because so much time is spent getting to know her in the first act of the movie, her slow transition into the warrior she has to become to raise her son and prepare him for the coming war is more impactful. Dark Fate tries to do the same, but it doesn't work as well because I swear the movie doesn't even spend 10 minutes establishing what Dani's life is like. We barely get to know characters like her father and her brother before they are killed up by the Rev 9. We don't even get to see what their relationship with Dani is like, even though they're her family. We don't see enough of what it's like for her and her brother at work. It shows us where she works, and it shows us that they're in kind of a bad spot, but it doesn't show how that impacts them as people. It doesn't tell us how they're feeling. We just don't know enough about her as a person in order to understand how much the events of the film have impacted her and changed her as a person, which just makes her arc feel weak and underdeveloped. Terminator Dark Fate is a competently helmed movie. I think Tim Miller does a pretty good job with the directing. The action sequences in this movie are at least better than the action sequences in Terminator Genisys. I did really enjoy the first fight scene between the Rev 9 and Mackenzie Davis. That was awesome, and the car chase that followed it, as well as a couple fights between Arnold and the Rev 9, were awesome. But a lot of the action is surprisingly boring, which surprised me because the action sequences that Tim Miller directed in Deadpool 1 I found to be really enjoyable. But with this movie, they just didn't even feel real. I love the action in the first two Terminator movies because most of that action is actually happening. They didn't use CGI to film most of those sequences. A lot of it is practical effects and stunt work. There is just way too much CGI in this movie, and it is unbelievably obvious to the point where it's distracting. So distracting that it just pulled me out of the movie. The plane action sequence was probably the worst one, partly because the lighting was so dark that it was hard to see anything, but whenever I could see shit, I couldn't tell what was going on because there was so much shit flying all over the place. Even the things that are actually happening, like the car chases, as entertaining as they are, look fake because for some reason the movie has this abrasively shiny filter over it that just makes everything look bland and unappealing. There were times when I was watching this movie that I honestly felt like I was watching one of those really safe superhero movies like Justice League or Venom. It didn't take any risks. There's nothing about it that feels dangerous. It's just a kind of bloody T2 remake. But that's not what Terminator is. The first two movies are like hybrids of sci-fi and horror, especially when you have Arnold acting as this seemingly unstoppable force that will rip you in two if you peeve him off or if he's just programmed to kill you. Seriously, I would not want to be chased down through an alleyway by this thing. As for other positives, it's mildly consistent in terms of structure. That's it, really. It also didn't help that as good as Gabriel Luna is as the Rev 9, the Rev 9 just isn't that intimidating. Partly because he spends half the movie gratuitously trying to pay homage to the T-1000 from T2, but also because he spends most of the movie getting his ass whooped. He spends more time tripping over bullets, getting blown up and flung all over the place more than he does actually killing people and kicking ass. Terminator Dark Fate really disappointed me. I wanted to like this movie so much. I was rooting for this movie to be at the very least good, but in the end, Terminator 3 3.0 is just further proof that Terminator should never have been a franchise. They should have just stopped making these movies after Judgment Day. That would have been fine, but nope. It just had to get turned into a long, boring, and bland franchise that's very clearly running out of ideas. So, Terminator 3 3.0? It's better than Genisys? That's not really hard, but still. But in all seriousness, there are a few things that I did legitimately like in this movie. It's not all bad. There are some entertaining aspects, but overall I found it to be a pretty bad movie. So with that said, Terminator 3 3.0 gets a 4 out of 10. So that was my spoiler-filled review of Terminator Dark Fate, otherwise known as Terminator 3 3.0. I do hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Thank you so much as always for watching, but before I go, I would just like to ask you guys, what did you think of Terminator 3 3.0? Did you think it was good? Did you think it was bad? Did you think it was somewhere in the middle? Please leave your thoughts down below in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Until next time, take care.